Hey there, everybody. Brought my glasses on the way into work today. I tried to grade anyway with them, but just managed to give myself a bit of a headache. So let's see, today we're going to finish up Chapter 3, looking at development, widely defined. On Wednesday we start the next chapter, and I'm actually going to have a guest speaker come on in on Wednesday. I try to, for regions that I have not been to, I try to have someone come in who's been on the ground somewhere. And David Kelly over in geography, he's done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, so he'll come on in Wednesday and give you guys a good, real summary lecture. Let's see, I think that's all about I have as far as announcements. Any general questions before I jump off into talking about development? All right. So let's see, if you remember last time we were talking through basically different theories of development and how they've changed through time through different critiques. So now we've gotten up to the 90s, relatively recently. New economic geography. Well, this is a field that, when it looks at development, it looks at kind of the underlying building blocks of development in a country, right? So what it wants to take care of are things like transportation networks, right? Disease burdens, things that in general negatively affect an economy of a place and make it so it's like more difficult for it to develop. Education, right? These kind of broad things that could kind of lift all ships a bit so that you have more possibility of economic development on your own afterward. And these are, these kind of sound like no-brainers, but through time, these things kind of came about through thinking through, well, what are the problems on the ground of the different places we're talking about, rather than just coming in from elsewhere and deciding what problems are in places, asking people in places, or at least doing that more. One of the big examples of all this is Hong Kong. Well, China specifically, when they did decide to open their economy, they focused on the basics. They also put in a ton of infrastructure that would in general decrease costs for manufacturing, right? Putting in a lot of resources, as I said, a lot of infrastructure, and taking care of kind of like, well, the main things that you got to really support development. In Hong Kong here being a country that is in the tropics, and this kind of goes against a lot of the old thinking about development. We've already talked a bit about environmental determinism, right? Environmental determinism. I came across this little meme and I realized it was like, well, this is very environmentally deterministic, right? But it's also self-serving, right? If you come from a place and you're gonna say, yeah, we're tough here because our weather makes us tougher than anybody else. It's like, well, every place has tough weather. Every place has these things that they go through. It doesn't define a people. So just a refresher, environmental determinism, belief that environmental differences explain everything from intelligence to wealth. So a lot of this old environmental determinism, specifically, it would be geographers coming from, say, Britain. A lot of it is from Britain because, again, we have the lineage of using that language, right? So a lot of our research and information comes from that. But, they would suggest things that, well, the tropics would never really develop, they would say, because it's just too hot and you just can't be very productive. And so it just makes so the people are less productive. And well, time has shown us that is not the case. Some of the largest economies in the world are in tropical regions. They just take different development strategies, right? Kind of depends on what they do. Hong Kong, Singapore being a really great example. Tons of places that have been able to develop, even if they have difficulty of climate and weather. And it's one of those things in geography where geographers are very conflicted because there are real things that places have to deal with because of their climate or their weather or whatever their conditions are, be it just like randomly a place that doesn't have a lot of natural resources. compared to a place that is next to it that may have a ton of oil or gold or who knows what, right? So there are real limitations that we gotta look at, but we gotta make sure it doesn't define what we think the capability for a place is. One of the examples of this from the book is, we're looking at a couple big earthquakes, right? One that hit Haiti, one that hit Chile, and why they are so different, right? The old way of thinking would have been, well, Haiti is in the tropics, and so, you know, they'll have more damage and they'd have more deaths from a natural disaster. But when you look at, well, what actually happened, how are the places different? Well, Chile has a lot of building codes, right? And it has, just as important as laws about buildings, it has actual enforcement of those codes, right? Earthquake resistant. Haiti did not have any of those kind of rules, right? You also have a case in Haiti where, well, during the colonial period, most of the place was completely deforested and all the wood was sold off, right? And the country itself, well, didn't get to keep any of that money. So they have a bunch of kind of deforested area, and deforested areas, if you have an earthquake, you'll have a much harder bunch of landslides, a lot more damage will actually happen compared to a place where you haven't had that history. So dualism, this is basically a concept we've been talking about kind of the whole class for a little while. Dualism is situations in which two areas are in relationship with one another. Trade is an example, and one area is developing basically at the expense of the other, right? So you have places that are developing because they're getting in a lot of raw resources that are very cheap, and they're making quality goods, and then the place that they're getting those raw resources from, because their economies have not been able to develop, they're not making their own goods, so it's the only market they have to buy modern conveniences are the countries that are making all the money off of it, right? Another term we've talked about a little bit, unequal exchange, uneven relationship between low labor costs and high value products, right? That same dualism relationship that we've been talking about. It's, again, one of those things when I talk about the effective demand problem where your country, if it doesn't have a middle class who's making an okay amount of money, you don't have consumers of the industries that you would want to develop, right? And you also don't have workers in those industries, right? So it's a cycle. And well, if you lose your middle class, for example, well then your whole economy bottoms up because you don't have people making things, you don't have people buying the things that they're making, right? One person's job creates another person's demand, and so on and so forth. So geographers look at commodity chains, right? The great thing is we're in the information age, and so there's a ton of information about, well, how much do products cost? Where do the parts come from? Where were they paid where those parts came from? Is there any part along the commodity chain where maybe the price is inflated or maybe it's deflated, right? Many would argue that if in a commodity chain, if there's some place where people are working at some part on that commodity and they're not making, you know, a living wage, well then the argument would be made that that is a place where prices have been deflated and they should be reinflated so that people can, well, make enough money to sustain their own economy. Classic example of the book, we basically talked last time a lot about chocolate and the chocolate industry. That's a good example. The one from the book goes into a little bit more detail. Coffee, right? A number of years ago, a lot of people were kind of getting the word out that people who were actually picking the coffee and whatnot could not basically make ends meet, right? They're in countries where they couldn't really, that was the main thing of their economy, because in the old colonial model, they would often decide that a whole region should just focus on one crop, right? That leads to a lot of different problems, including if you have monoculture, if you have kind of one big crop that is your main part of your economy, well, if you have a blight or something happens to that crop, your entire economy can go under, right? Especially if people are making, in this case, the amount that people would of coffee beans that they would pick per day, they would get paid basically just enough to sustain themselves so that they'd be able to have a little bit of food and get back to work the next day, right? There was never anything more for them to be able to have money to create any kind of consumer demand for anything on their own. The book uses another example looking at actually Chicago and Minnesota as having in the past a similar relationship for 150 years. Chicago was, growing city, growing economy, and they were getting a lot of their kind of primary things that they would use for their industry from northern Minnesota, right? We cut down the forests, we mined a lot of ore. Chicago, the city, would make these into high-end goods, and Chicago would be making a lot of money, while northern Minnesota just did not economically prosper, right? It wasn't until quite a bit later that even lower Minnesota's economy was able to pick up and have its own industry, but it was well after Chicago, and it's not like we've ever been able to catch up with the growth that Chicago still has had through time, right? They're still a bigger economy. So again, looking at development and things that could be done, a lot of things in the past that people thought would be helping a country don't necessarily help, right? So for example, one of the main examples looking at food programs, right? Obviously, if you have someplace that has a major thing like a drought, if people are on the ground are hungry, then it makes sense to donate food. Sometimes that can hurt local farmers though, right? If local farmers, if their demand is completely dried up because food is coming in from abroad that is free, right? The other thing about international food aid is that there's a strong feeling that in general it's for political purposes, right? Countries will donate resources to places because they want them to be politically aligned with them and have perhaps very specific trading relationships. A lot of these aid programs are actually very often connected to the colonial legacy of different countries, although this changes up because Latin America here used to, of course, they're former colonies of Spain and Portugal, but Spain and Portugal have not had kind of extra money for any kind of aid for 100 years, so they aren't in a good position to do that. The United States has kind of taken over that relationship and considers Latin America a sphere of influence of the United States. Another example of how aid can have unintended consequences. There's a little area in our book looking at dead white people clothing, right? Basically, clothes, right? A lot of people will donate clothes. Seems like it's for a good cause. But when these, if you have a country that all of a sudden has a whole bunch of clothes coming from outside sources and they're donations, right? So they're not expensive. Places want to have their own textiles. They want to have their own clothes, right? So all this cheap or free clothes comes in, and it puts a lot of people who would want to be making clothes out of business. Also, the distribution of clothes that are coming in through donations, this is part of what we call the informal economy. Informal economy and formal economy, these are terms that will come back more and more. In a nutshell, the formal economy is like businesses that are regulated and that pay taxes, right? And so they add something to the government's budget for other things that the government will want to do depending on the place, right? Many places they want to invest in some healthcare and some education, some infrastructure. If everyone is working in the informal economy, an example of the informal economy locally would be if someone is having a garage sale, right? Garage sale, they haven't really gotten permission from the city, they're not paying taxes, right? They're not really connected to the economy in that way. So that's the informal economy. When we look at places that are less developed, usually the informal economy is much larger, right? And it makes prices less because they're not paying taxes and different things, but it also means that there's not money for government services as much. So it makes a lot of sense in local contexts, but it's not great for overall economic development. Let's see, I kind of said a bunch of this. See if there's any parts that I missed. No? No, basically I just said that stuff, okay. So alternative approaches to development that these are all kind of come in vogue much more recently, and a lot of these have been put into place in places for like maybe 10 years, maybe some of these things 20 years, but not a ton of time. And a lot of these alternative approaches were actually doing really well in places until the pandemic hit, and now everything is kind of like up in the air a bit. So let's take these one at a time. And it's like I said before, a lot of these will sound like a no-brainer, right? Participatory development, engaging with the people and the place where the development effort is concentrated to tap their local knowledge and create development goals that they want, right? So rather than coming in from up high and deciding, this is what you should all do here, and this worked elsewhere, so it should work here, that's not always the case, right? You may not even necessarily know what it is that's a need in a local place. This could be the case, actually there's a specific example in the map or in the book, where, you had a place that had a drought, right? And so they needed food, and so the old strategy would have been to ship in food, right? Well, if you went and talked to people on the ground about the lack of food and the drought, they may let you know that they have a bunch of wells that are not super deep, and they don't have money to repair them, equipment that falters, or to make wells that are deeper, and so they could actually bring back their agriculture if they had help with that, right? And that's a completely different equation, right? To help people get resources to their own water so that they can grow their own food, so their farmers are making money, right? Creating a local supply rather than just bringing in resources from other places seems to be more of a sustainable development strategy. So development and primary production. We've talked before about a lot of countries kind of being stuck where they're making their one thing, right? And this was often set up during colonialism, and they have that one thing that they make, and they're not being paid much for it, right? At that place. Increasingly, what places are doing is they're looking at things like this example of mines. Phosphates actually are quite expensive on the international market, but the places where they're actually mining it and how much the miners are actually making is a very small amount. So in this example, they looked at basically creating a trust fund with some of the profits from this mining to aid in just general development of a place, right? And supporting local other businesses. So another term in this chapter, one you've no doubt heard before, sustainable development, meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations. So there's two views on sustainable development. Strong sustainable development is kind of like the radical strategy of sustainable development. This is people who basically feel like there's too much of a focus on consumerism anyway. If we have a society where we just consume and buy things, well, to keep on buying things, you've got to throw things away, right? And so that leads to a lot of garbage, leads to a lot of pollution, leads to a lot of environmental problems. So there's people in this strong, sustainable development camp who feel like, we need to focus on the needs of the environment and make that disconnected from the needs of our economy. The weak sustainable development, which is actually what the majority of people looking into sustainable development lean toward, is the feeling that, well, that a certain amount of development and a certain amount of wealth that a country can generate can aid in their sustainability, right? And so if you have a country that has a good amount of wealth, in the book, the example of the United States is used. We have a lot of nature preserves. We have relatively cleaner technologies than lots of other places, but that takes an amount of money. And so you need to have your economy linked to it, and you need to develop in order to just have your development be sustainable. Things like alternative energy sources, wind power or solar power, those cost money. A lot of places would love to not use polluting sources of power, but that costs a lot of money. People don't have it. So let's see, the last example, I believe, looking at more recent strategies, we actually talked about fair trade a bit when we were talking about chocolate in the other class. The example of coffee is used in the book, mostly because coffee has kind of a longer history to it. But I think I talked about the examples already about people weren't making a sustainable amount of money in this industry. So fair trade involves a lot of certification, right? You have people who trace back through that commodity chain. Well, how much are people making in the different areas, and what are they doing? And are they doing something that they should be having more money for? Is there a place in the commodity chain where it's inflated, and so that money has been taken from one place from the other? But it raises costs to have people who will check all these things and certify products. But the thought of most people who believe in fair trade is the certification process is worth it because they want to, in general, feel better about the products they're buying. All right. Well, I wrapped up that section quicker than I thought I would. So I'm going to try something different today when we work on the questions. Let's see. All right. So this is what I'm going to do. I still don't have anything to write with in here. I'm going to have you self-select into your groups. All right. I want you to have groups of 4 or 5 people per group. No more than 5, because we have 5 specific roles that we're going to try out. So when you get in your group, find out, well, who has the closest birthday? That will be facilitator number 1, right? What is the second closest birthday? That'll be number 2, the recorder, the person who's going to write this stuff down. In this way, well, the groups often, you'll have kind of the same people doing the same roles. This is an effort to kind of change that up a bit. And because this is a bit complicated, giving you a little extra time today, but we're going to do the creative and critical thinking questions that are left. There are still to do. I think there's 3 of them. And like I said, I'm going to let you self-select. So go ahead, groups of no more than 5, 4 to 5, no more than 5. You can have a group of 4 if you need.
January.
When's your birthday?
I'm in May.
When's your birthday? Closest?
I'm closest. When's yours?
January 2nd. I'm February.
Nice. I'm sorry.
No, I would like to do that.
Do you want to use this or you get yours?
I got mine first.
Green 4.
Talking about
All right, go for it.
Kind like talking points or the conversations.
Yeah.
I had art today. How did you guys have?
Lane had a busy day.
So cool. I had the group coffee over there. I haven't got anything from there. I just made my own.
You should get the photos. They're good.
Oh, 6, 7. I don't have my my computer's dead, so my textbook is dead.
I thought I misspelled my name for a second.
Wait, what's somebody else's rules?
Oh, wait, yeah.
I'm the recorder. You're June?
Push is bad
He's
when we
bad,
come
yeah,
to
yeah.
consensus too quickly.
You're the reflector. And you're the checker. Okay.
Say everyone, if I could get your attention real quick. Like I said, I broke my glasses, so I couldn't read that. Number 6 here is a continuation of a previous thing. Just invent a product. They need you to invent a product. So just invent a product that you will use as your example for number 6. Sorry. If any other questions seem confusing, let me know.
Your poor glasses.
Using the commodity chain to develop a fair trade product, determine whether the fact that you purchased this fair trade product created or avoided unequal exchange.
Oh.
So do we have to invent one, or do we just like come up with one?
Do you want like a fresh invention, or just, can we find like an example?
You can do either, actually. Whatever makes the most sense for you.